Be deliberate in everything that you do. Decide on what your platforms are that you're using and use them and stick to them and have norms and expectations about how they are used. So, for example, at Humentum, we use Slack for all of our internal communications, and we use email only for external communication.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce herself as usual. Christine, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm Christine Sow, and I am the CEO of Humentum. Humentum is an organization, a nonprofit that works across the global development and humanitarian assistance sector to really help the organizations implementing programs to realize the strategic value of the operations side of what they do. So we really work on operating models, institutional architecture, people and culture, funding and financial systems, risk and compliance. So we believe that in order for an organization to be able to really deliver on its mission, it needs to be able to operate in a way that is equitable, accountable, and resilient. And so we help organizations build that internal to themselves and then also into the partnerships that they have with other organizations. I'm an epidemiologist by training.
Oh, you are?
I am. I have a PhD in epidemiology, and I worked in global health for 25 years. I've worked from the community level through up to the donor and global policy level. And so I've really been on the side of the challenges of how do you deliver programs and how do you reach, goals and targets. And I love being at Humentum now because I can bring that experience to really helping us support other organizations to deliver on their missions.
And is this your first role as a CEO, or you have?
No, I was the CEO of the Global Health Council.
Okay.
We relaunched the Global Health Council in 2013, and so I led the relaunch and then handed it off to my successor in 2016 when I moved to work for PSI as the Chief Operating Officer. So I've been in executive management for a long time. Again, I've also been I was a team leader for health for USAID in Mali. I was the chief of child survival for for UNICEF in Mali. So have worked at that executive level for quite some time.
Okay. I'm an anthropologist, but I actually did several courses besides that, and one of them is epidemiology. So I was, but I passed. But that's the only thing you can say. Can say about that. But no, great. I'm really fascinated by what you and your organization have been doing for quite a while now, and that is really looking at, what is the future of the NGO? What's the role that we need to play considering everything that's happening? Can you talk us a little bit through it, why that question came up and what you've been doing within your own organization, but also you were instrumental in bringing a number of NGOs together here in the US to look at the future.
Yeah. So as I said, we really work on the operations side of global development. And that can be quite transactional and tactical. It's delivering training, it's helping, develop compliance policies, that sort of thing. But really where we have shifted is to the idea that we need equity across global development, and that locally led development should be the ideal state that we are all working towards. But in order to have locally led development, we need to have organizations that are able to exercise autonomy around their own operating models, around their decision making, around their business models, what kind of funding they're going to seek, and what kind of programs they want to execute. We believe that the best programming is the programming that's designed and executed closest to those who are affected by the issue that's being addressed. And so at Humentum, we have participated in and really observed and witnessed all of the big thinking that is going on across global development around shifting power and what the future of the sector should be, and the ethics of development work. And what we've seen is that there are a lot of very smart people asking a lot of very important and provocative questions. And there are ideas that emerge from these discussions. What's missing is how you actually translate those ideas into reality. So on the one hand, you can say, oh, donors should be, providing funding to their recipients at the local level directly, and that'll solve all the problems. But actually, if you start scratching away at the surface, we find that, the compliance rules have been set up to really get in the way of that. They are asking for standards that a lot of organizations don't meet. Funders don't, for example, systematically, fully and fairly fund the work that they are asking organizations to do, which means that organizations are expected to subsidize their work. So how do we correct this? How do we get donors to be full and fair funders? So it's that it's that level of how the ecosystem works that we are really focusing on. We try to meet organizations and partners where they are, acknowledge what their challenges are, help them think through what are the root problems that we're going to try to address, and then really come up with practical solutions. And we come at this from the perspective that there's no one size fits all. Mm-hmm. And so when we're looking at working with an organization on a solution, we think about, well, what kind of consulting, assessments, and advising might you need? What kind of analysis might you need to really break down the problem into manageable pieces? What kind of training do you need for your staff to help reorient them in the way that you now want to be working? Is there a community of practice or a community of peers that you can be part of that will help you co-create solutions and vent when you're frustrated with something, and meeting other people who are working on the same kinds of challenges? And then advocacy is a really important part of this, because again, in a sector where funders are setting a lot of the rules and regulations, they may have a clear idea of why they're coming up with a particular rule, but when they roll it out, they may do it in a way that the implementers say, we can't possibly do that. That's not designed to work with the way that we actually do things in reality. And so advocacy comes in as a very important part of that, because we can advocate back to donors saying, hey, we recognize the end outcome that you're trying to get, but the way you're going about it isn't going to work. And so can we come up together with a solution that works for everybody? So, we do consulting, training, advocacy, and community as our approach.
If I would ask you, to come up with, let's say, the top 3 or top 5 of the changes that, let's call them the US global NGOs, or maybe this is relevant also for the European. I don't know if you have talked with them as well. the changes that they have to go through to be ready for the future, what would that top 3 or top 5 be then?
So I'll just say we really think about our stakeholder group as a three-legged stool. We think about funders, international NGOs, and national and local NGOs.
Okay.
And we believe it's important to acknowledge and really think about the interdependencies between the three of them, because we work in a sector where they're all very, very much linked in the way that we execute work. But, in terms of what should INGOs in particular be thinking about in terms of how to be relevant and how to adapt for the future. Mission, we have our missions, so I'm not going to throw up in the air the mission necessarily. But I think it's important to really look at how are you executing on that mission. If you're a mission-driven organization, how are you working with the communities that in traditional speak might have been called beneficiaries? But now we are really pushing towards a democratization of participation in design, in execution, in accountability, in governance. So as an international organization, how are you changing the way that you partner to fully value, respect, and acknowledge the partners, your community partners? And that means necessarily giving up some control, and that can be scary. We recognize that that can be scary, and that you may feel that carries some risk. But what we are really advocating for is a movement towards more trust-based partnerships, trust-based compliance, trust-based philanthropy. And it's looking at, what are the elements that are needed to say we all trust each other, we believe that we're working at a similar standard of quality and accountability, and then putting the partnerships together on that basis. Second thing is, I think it's really important, we talk a lot about capacity building or capacity strengthening. Thinking about capacity not just as a one-off thing, even if you say, oh, it's a year-long investment, it's not just for 1 year and then it's done. Think about, well, yes, we should help an organization or the people in an organization upskill. We should help them grow their capacity. But also what needs to be put in place to sustain that level of capacity. And that goes back to this idea of financial health, full and fair coverage of the work that's being done. And we are really, one of our calls to action is really that INGOs, in working with their local partners, and this goes the same for funders in general, really should think about going beyond just funding project costs, but also including money for upskilling, for capacity strengthening. They should include funds for building reserves and unrestricted funding within the local partner organizations. So it's rethinking the way that they fund, also to not just be commissioning work for a project, but also really helping to equalize the financial playing field across all of the organizations that are part of a particular partner.
And Christine, if have you shared this with the funding community, and if so, what is their reaction?
Yeah.
And the same question for your staff, because I do think that if you give this as a recommendation to the sector, your own organization needs to go through a process of change as well, right? In terms of how
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I'll take the first question first, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing internally at Humentum. In terms of sharing this with the funding community, yes, we are sharing this increasingly. We now have a theory of change. You can find it on our website. And we are now really using that as the basis for all of the work that we're doing. I have to say, we developed our theory of change, but it was also influenced by the conversations that we've been having with the funder community, with the INGO community, with the NNGO community. And we spent about 18 months doing research on the funder starvation cycle. We published a report at the end of March 2022 on the starvation cycle that was funded by a group of foundations. We're very happy that they funded that work and that they're interested in this. We have some other partnerships with several foundations who are interested really in moving towards full and fair funding. And so we are seeing uptake of these ideas, but it's slow. And I will say it's funders. It's also governing boards of directors of INGOs. Frequently we see disconnect between what, for example, a CEO or executive leadership in an INGO may be thinking about and what their board may be thinking about. And traditionally boards are more conservative and see more risk involved in trying to move towards these full and fair approaches to partnership. But we are encouraged, and we believe that there is actually a lot of traction around this. And, especially with the real momentum that is building around locally led development, we are really looking also to help provide a platform for NGOs, national and local NGOs, to come together to advocate for themselves around these issues. Because, we could be an intermediary, but it's much better to have people be able to speak for themselves and have their voices heard. Switching over to your second question about Humentum. So we are a nonprofit business, much more that is our model rather than an NGO. So we don't give grants. We don't have sub agreements in the way that INGOs work. However, we believe one of our internal core values is walk the talk. And so we believe in everything that we are doing, we are also trying to mirror internally. And so we have what we call our equity principles. Again, you can find those on our website. And we are in the process of finalizing our equity metrics that we will also be sharing. And right now, annually, we provide a list of equity accomplishments and achievements that we've managed to do that is both internal and external. Because we believe that, if we are calling for equity across the sector, we really have to have that as our guiding principle internally. I talked about bringing the strategic value of operating models to the sector. We also have been doing a restructuring of Humentum, really to focus on ensuring our own financial health and sustainability. We have a very strong and dedicated internal push to create a culture that is equitable, resilient, and accountable. And we do things like, every 6 months we have an engagement survey so we can see how employees are doing and how they rate us. But we don't just get the results of those surveys. We also make commitments about what we will do in the 6 months till the next survey, and we report back to the entire organization.
Is that something? Sorry, is that something you started the engagement survey because of COVID, or that was already before?
So we were already doing it. I joined Humentum at the end of 2019, and we were doing an engagement survey then. We have, I think, improved it and made it more. We've really focused on, okay, we're getting this data back from staff. What are we going to do with it? We're not just collecting it for the sake of having data. We're collecting it because it needs to be informing how we manage ourselves. And so that's the part where making commitments, taking action, and holding ourselves accountable is really a critical part of the engagement process at Humentum. We also, I think this is really worth noting, at the end of 2020 or during 2020, we actually restructured our entire compensation approach to be an equity-based compensation approach. So we now have transparent and publicly available grading and pay scales. Again, you can go on our website and find all of those. We don't negotiate salary. We peg any position that's open to a salary, and we advertise it as such. We let people know when they're being interviewed. And we want people to understand what they are going to get when they come to us. And we don't want it to be a situation of asymmetric information where we hold the power and they're left guessing as they come into the organization. We really have looked at our entire compensation and benefits package from the perspective of equity, but also trying to remove any moments of opportunity for bias or discrimination. And so, for example, we have also uncoupled performance from compensation. We now have very clearly laid out the progression of salary, again, that anybody can see in our pay policy. And we deal with performance separate to that, because we want to remove the opportunity for somebody to introduce either intentional discrimination and bias or unintentional discrimination or bias when awarding compensation increases. So we've really been trying to do all of those things internally, as well as advocate for them and facilitate them externally.
Great. Are you familiar with the work of Frederick Lalu? He wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay. So is it a lot of what you're trying to do, is that in line with what he wrote, in terms of, or is it very different?
I think that I will be honest, it's been a while since I looked at his work. I think it's along the same lines, but we have a really interesting vantage point because we do a lot of convening. We convene peer groups within the sector, probably more than 300 a year at this point.
Oh.
We have different groups. We have a CEO group that meets monthly. We have a senior HR and operations leadership group that meets twice a month. We have all these groups that come together. And so it means that we can be inspired by what we learn in the external business climate, but we also are asking questions of the peers that we are working with across the sector. And so we do spot polling, we do Menti polls, we do surveys. We have these roundtables, these regular roundtables where we're gathering insight, we're asking questions. And through all of that, it really informs our positions. It informs the products that we develop and that we offer to the global development and humanitarian assistance sectors. And it also informs how we work internally. So while we're inspired by work that's been done elsewhere, we're also increasingly being very agile and iterative in the way that we do things. So as we go, we can make changes if we realize that maybe, we've got a gap in the way we're doing something, or we tried something out and it's fallen flat. We can adjust it and move on.
And talking about inspired or not, if all kinds of folks listen to these episodes of the podcast, also business people, what if some of them would say, hey, this sounds like, our ESG? What would be your answer? Yes, no, different?
Well, I think, for me, ESG is a way of working, but it's a way of saying where your commitments lie. And so, I think that there is, credible ESG and there's symbolic ESG. And what we're really pushing for is, if you are a mission-driven organization, whether you're a corporate for-profit and you have an ESG arm, or you are a nonprofit delivering on a mission, you need to, if you're going to commit to principles, you need to internalize them as well. And so, we know about nonprofits where internally there's a toxic work culture because of the way that things are structured, they're run. Leaders need to model the behavior that they want to see across their organization. And unfortunately, we know that there are leaders who model very negative behavior. And so, I think it is, you have walk, talk, listen in your title. And I think it's about walking the talk, and especially listening, and then incorporating what you hear into how you go forward.
Right. I'm just wondering, so in terms of your how you do your review, etc. Did that change? I mean, in many organizations, it's the board that will do the review. Sometimes they will ask some key staff. How is that going for you as a leader, or all the different leaders in your organization?
Well, the way that we look at performance at Humentum, and I will say right now, this is still a work in progress for us. We're actually just switching over onto a new human resources information system, HRIS platform, that's going to facilitate the way that we manage performance. We've switched onto a new operating system called EOS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System, that has performance approaches within it, and we're still building some of this. So I want to be clear on that. But one of the key principles to performance at Humentum, and I would say this is very much part of my deep core beliefs, and I hope that this is how I as a leader bring my vision of performance to Humentum, is the idea that it is not one and done. It is not work, achieve this target at all costs, and then once you do, you're done. We have core values at Humentum that we really use and are trying to internalize in everything we do. And so when we think about performance, we try to think about how are we using our core values in actually actioning on our work. We are flexible in the way that we work and our expectations of staff. We don't have a 4-day work week, but we have a 4-day meeting week. Fridays are no meeting Fridays and are really supposed to be for catch up. We have every quarter, we have a week that's called a quiet learning week, where we cancel all standing meetings and we let people use that week for catch up and for learning and development. We have, during our work day, so we're about 50 people. We're across 14 countries, 7 time zones, more or less. And so to help manage that wide range of working times, we have core work hours that are from, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's 9 to 12 every day. It switches a little bit depending on whether it's summer or winter in different places. But we say you need to be available for these core hours. Outside of those core hours, you can arrange your schedule according to what you need to do to get your work done. And I encourage people to, on their Outlook calendar, to put in when they're not available. So we have, one staff member who has a young son, and that staff member has on their calendar, my son's dinner time. And we do not bother that person during dinner time. And that is okay. And, so we want to be flexible. We want to recognize that, especially because we're 100% remote. So we could potentially be online all the time. We should not be. And so we want to recognize that people's work and personal lives can bleed into each other. We are whole human beings, not human beings who easily compartmentalize. And so we work, with that very much as our approach.
Thank you for sharing that. And just a quick question. So were you fully remote already before COVID, or is it something that developed during COVID?
So we were fully remote. Humentum
Okay.
Humentum was created in 2017 of a
Okay.
merger of three other organizations. And at the time, the decision was made to be fully remote. Although we were fully remote, up until COVID, we were doing a lot of in-person work, delivering trainings. We had a big conference every year. And so the pandemic did force us to change our business model very quickly. We had to pivot quickly. We went from being able to see each other in person at these events and trainings and things to not seeing each other at all. And so we really dug in. And again, because we advise so many organizations, we really focused on, okay, how do you successfully run a remote organization? And we worked with our community to help them strengthen the way that they were managing remotely. But we also took what we were learning and we applied it internally. So the one other thing I'll note is that in 2019, when I joined, we were about a third of the staff in the US, a third in the UK and Europe, and a third elsewhere. And we also changed the way that we recruit to have recruitment that is visible in many more geographies. And we really have used our remote status as what we see as an opportunity for us. And so now we are about 50% US, Europe, UK, and 50% Africa, India, and then some in Central America. So we have also shifted the makeup of our remote staff because we've strengthened the way that we work remotely.
I have talked to a lot of folks and about remote and what Zoom has done and not. So there seems to be leaders who say, oh, it's so difficult to build a team virtually, and then others are saying no, it's possible. So it's the new reality anyway, so you need to make it work. So what are some of the tips, quick tips that you have for people who are still struggling with how do I build my team when I never see them in person?
Be deliberate in everything that you do. And have decide on what your platforms are that you're using and use them and stick to them and have norms and expectations about how they are used. So for example, at Humentum, we use Slack for all of our internal communications, and we use email only for external communication. And we're very, and if somebody internally, if one of my colleagues emails me something, I will say, hey, remember, I'm putting this back into Slack because that's where we handle internal communication. So it's a certain level of being deliberate. It's being deliberate about your organizational culture. That includes, what your values are, what your norms are, expectations, behaviors, and again, really making sure that you provide reminders of that you model that behavior, that you are intentional about what kinds of meetings you have and when. So we have a monthly all-staff meeting. We now have a quarterly state of the company meeting where we go across all of our annual targets and see how we're doing. We also review our values and our vision with staff on a regular basis. That's really important. I think one of the areas, and we struggle with this as well, one of the areas that's really difficult remotely is induction. Bringing in somebody who's new to the organization, getting them oriented properly. Sometimes you have the benefit of hiring somebody who's in a city where there are other people who work for you already. And so we encourage them to get together and meet in person. But a lot of times you don't. And so again, you have to be really thoughtful about how you orient that person to being part of the culture. And I think one of the best practices that other organizations use, and we're using increasingly, is the idea of having a work buddy and a social buddy. so that they don't have to just kind of float around and figure out who's who, but they have somebody who's really there to support them through that.
Mm. That's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because we did develop that for within the board, for new board members, a buddy. But I don't think we have it for staff. So that's I don't know why that happened, but that's actually I think it's a good idea with the board. I think most of the time it works, to link one individual with another.
If I could say just one more thing about being remote, it's also really important for leadership to consider the different challenges that people have in connecting to a remote environment. And that could be technology. It could be, do they have the right computer? Do they have the right Wi-Fi speed? Do they have, rolling blackouts where they live? So it can be technology. But it can also be, different people feel different levels of anxiety engaging this way. So we really try and provide different kinds of settings. So like big group settings, but also one-on-ones, small group breakouts, the possibility to write in a chat, so that people have the opportunity to contribute in a way that really aligns with their comfort levels. Last thing I'll say is that some people have visible or hidden disabilities that can hamper how they connect remotely. And especially, people whose first language is not the language that's being used in meetings, being conscious of that and getting people to talk a little bit more slowly, using transcript. Also, we have, occasionally you may have somebody who's hard of hearing and may not be able to follow what's being said. So you really need to make sure that people have their video on so that their lips moving is available. You can use the transcripts. So again, it's thinking through some of those things that some might be obvious and some may be less obvious in terms of facilitating people's engagement.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you mentioning that. And I think it's important. And also, reminding us that not... for many of us, English is not a first language. So and especially if you talk about being a global organization, right? So Christine, I would like to bring you to the next part of our conversation that is related to a 100-mile walk that I started doing now close to 11 years ago, because this year I will do my 11th 100 mile in Seattle from October 10 to 16. If you would, and I'm doing this walk and this podcast is a spin-off of this 100 mile, and I'm doing that to raise awareness and funds for hunger, poverty, and injustice. If you would be asked to walk 100 miles in a week, so that means 15 to 20 miles in a day, for which cause would you, walk 100 mile?
I mean, sorry, there are so many answers. One of the things that I've been struggling with, or really, and struggle is not the right word, I've been really thinking actively about over the last 2 years is I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I left when I was 18, and I spent most of my adult life until 10 years ago overseas, mostly in West Africa. And we moved back to the Washington, D.C. area 10 years ago. And then 2 years ago, during the pandemic, I moved back to Michigan. My mother is 90, and I moved here for her to be able to live with me. And it means that my husband is in one place for work. I've got a couple of kids in different places, one kid with me here. But I was coming home, and it was like, what does it mean to come home? And what does it mean to engage in a community? And for part of the pandemic, that wasn't an option because we weren't, we were all sitting at home. We weren't able to go out into the community. But now I occupy what I consider to be this kind of, I don't want to call it, it's not schizophrenic, but it's a bit of a split existence where, my focus at work is very global. It's very much about, it's mission driven, it's social justice driven, it is change driven. And that's what I do at work. And then thinking about what does it mean to live in a community on a daily basis, and kind of what's around you in a very tangible, touchable, seeable way all the time. And so, what would I walk for? I wouldn't walk for the global stuff that I do every day at work. That is, that has been my commitment for decades, and it will continue to be my commitment going forward. What I have been trying to figure out is, what is my commitment to my community? And how do I affect change? And it's been interesting because I absolutely work at like the policy level and the systems level. But being part of a community now, I've also been like, ooh, that one family, their car got repossessed and it got auctioned by the police, and they now have no car to get to work and to the doctor's appointments for their child who is sick. And there's a GoFundMe, and there's somebody in my neighborhood who is, actively fundraising for them, and I can make a difference there. And so that has been the thing that I've really been spending a lot of time thinking about. And I love my hometown. I love Michigan as a state. When you said 100-mile walk, I immediately thought, 100 miles along the shoreline of Lake Michigan or Lake Superior, because Michigan is this beautiful peninsula. So I would walk for making a difference to my community and probably really direct giving that can help people, that thing that if they can just get that thing figured out, it like unlocks the future.
No, thank you for that. I would like to respond to two quick things. One is, during my 100-mile walk, I talk about, global hunger, sustainable development goals, but I also try to use it as an opportunity to show the local situation. So I walked through a number of states. So then I visit a local food bank or a shelter. I've been once outside of the US. I went to Indonesia, so then I show there the local issues as well. So I have something similar to what you just mentioned, and I would like to remind the listeners and for you, maybe this is news, is that I did another episode with Emma Stenström. She lives in Sweden. I think she lives in Stockholm. But she intentionally moved from a good neighborhood where she lived to, maybe what we would call in the US the hood, but in purpose to because ultimately you need to link, you need to start co-creating, working together. So she did that really intentional. So I thought it was very interesting and fascinating when I was listening to her story. So if you have time, you should check out the conversation that I had with her. Christine, when I walk, I'm often accompanied by other people for a couple of miles, and then we talk about why are we on Earth? Why am I doing this, for God's sake, for the 11th time? But also about spirituality and religion. And then very often we talk about, hey, this next generation is maybe different. They institutionalized religion is disappearing or smaller, except for maybe the evangelical side. My question to you is, what do you see among the younger generation and around spirituality and religion? What do you observe, and is that indeed different than the older generation?
So, I think we know that it's different from the older generation. I have to say, I grew up in a multi-religion household, and I am in a multi-religion family, continue to be in one. I personally am not part of an institutional religion, and I have pretty big issues with the way that institutional religion, I think, is used for political means. That said, for me, I think there's very successful spiritual, you can have a very successful spiritual life without institutional religion. So they're not mutually exclusive, but they're also not mutually dependent. My kids and the kids I see around me and their friends, I can't think of any of them that practice an institutional religion on a regular basis. But what I do see is a shift, and I'm speaking about the United States at this point, but is really a shift, despite our political differences, which I think is more at the kind of middle-aged generation than at the younger generation. The younger generation just taking people for who they are, and kind of saying, why would we possibly think differently about somebody because of the color of their skin or because of who they love, and that they don't even get it. They're like, I don't even understand how that can be somebody's belief that we are fundamentally different and I'm better than you are. And so for me, I mean, that's not quite religion, it's not quite spirituality, but it is for me fundamentally about how we treat each other. And that's how I live. My spirituality and my religion is how we treat each other, and really just a very deep-seated belief that we are all equal. And I see that, I think, reflected more and more in the younger generation, and for me, that gives me a lot of hope.
Talking about treating each other, everybody equally, etc. My organization celebrated its 75th anniversary last year, and it was a time of reflecting. Also one of the reasons that they do another podcast series about my organization, talking with ex-board members, staff, etc. One of the things that we discussed is, how did we do as an organization around racial justice? And so if I ask you, if you look at the NGO sector as a whole, or let's say the interaction community within the US, right? And I know it's difficult to, if not impossible, to generalize because there are so many different. But how do you think that community did in terms of racial justice?
So I would not call our sector within the U.S. and kind of headquarters traditionally a diverse, welcoming sector. And I think that there has been a push to change that. I will be very candid. I think that there's I think that we are not necessarily pushing in the right direction, because in fact, if we're doing global development, again, I have a very deep-seated belief that the development that's going on should be controlled and led by the people who are closest to where it's happening. And so, I have great respect and give big kudos to organizations that are looking at disbanding their headquarters, traditionally US-based, for example, and moving leadership across the globe to be much more located in the places where they work. For me, that is the way that for global development, we need to be diversifying and responding to racial justice. It's racial justice, but it's not racial justice within the US, because we're still in that very, northern, top-down, rich country, colonialist, all of those terms that we want to use, position vis-a-vis the communities that we're talking about helping, when in fact, I think it's a question of shifting power, shifting control, shifting accountability and decision-making and budgetary authority and all of those things towards communities to be able to work for themselves rather than somebody else controlling what's happening in their community.
Talking about global development, Christine, is we as a world, we came up with the 17 sustainable development goals, and it's not perfect, but I personally think, okay, it's what we have, so let's work with that. At least it's something kind of we agreed upon. But what do you want the listeners to know about those 17 SDGs? And then in relation to that question, I recently came across the inner development goals. And maybe, this is piggybacking on what you mentioned earlier in our conversation is, there are certain things that you need to internalize. And I think the group of the community that came up with the inner development goals said, the reason that we are not reaching those goals or we're going too slow, and actually the Human Development Report that came out today is saying we were going backwards. This group that came up with the inner development goals says that because we don't pay proper attention to the abilities and skills and qualities that you need as an individual and as a community to really work on those SDGs. That's why, we are facing these enormous challenges and it's going too slow. So two questions to you. One is, what do you want the listeners to know about the SDGs? And second, can you maybe reflect a bit on the inner development goals?
Yeah. Well, and I think that maybe my comment about the SDGs, it bridges very well to this idea of the inner development goals, because the Millennium Development Goals were very much developed by a group of people sitting around and coming up with them and imposing them on the developing world, quote unquote. The big shift with the Sustainable Development Goals was moving to universality. And the idea that, these are not goals that are only for a certain group of countries. These are goals for all countries. And that's pretty radical. And especially coming from the US, where the US traditionally doesn't sign on to anything. We had a lot of questions. I was involved, I was with Global Health Council during the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I was very active in civil society and at the UN and everything while that was going on. And, we were like, what is the US going to think about this? And is the US going to report on it? And no, exactly. And so, what I want people to to think about with the Sustainable Development Goals is the importance of having a universal approach to development. We're not talking about those people over there and pulling them out of poverty. We're talking about all of our societies, and these are standards and quality of living and well-being that should apply everywhere. And I mean, frankly, if we take a magnifying glass to the United States, we have some pretty abysmal development metrics, and that don't get enough attention. So so I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are really important. I have definitely seen, an increase in familiarity and uptake across a lot of countries. But again, I think universality is really important. But I also see that, there are countries like the US who frankly just kind of can't be bothered. So that's disappointing. For the inner development goals, it's really thinking about capabilities and personal development, and I don't want to just, it's not the individual because it's the power of the collective as well. But again, I think that's a way that we see a representation of this idea of universality, because those are things that everybody can work on. And again, it's recognizing the inherent value in each and every one of us, and the idea that I'm no better than you. I may have differences to you, but let's work on identifying, each of our sweet spots, and like, what are we, what are we interested in? What brings us joy to work on? How can we contribute best? And then what are those skills and capabilities and, the information and expertise that you can then develop and bring to a problem. And so, that is a fundamental piece of then looking towards those larger global policy goals, like the sustainable development goals.
Christine, I really enjoy this conversation, and I appreciate, not only telling about your organization and your points of view, but also I think we are getting to know you through this conversation as well. I'm going one step further in this process, and that is going in the direction of music, which is very important to me. And I always ask a question to my guests about, if I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies who you are, which song would that be and why?
And I know you gave this to me ahead of time, and I didn't come up with a good answer. And I'll say the reason I didn't come up with a good answer is because I have really eclectic taste in music. I can listen to and enjoy just about anything. And I will say, like, last night I went to a concert, the Black Keys. That's a US indie rock group. That was awesome, and it was just wonderful seeing them, and just like really guitar, really good bass. I love American folk music. I've been really into Rhiannon Giddens, who is an incredible artist, and she's trained as an opera singer, but has really just brought so much life and just visibility to American folk music. She's written an opera now that is debuted at Spoleto in South Carolina. It'll be in LA at the end of October. I'm going to go see it, called Omar, that's based on the memoir of an enslaved man in the 1800s in the United States. It's his true memoir, but now has been turned into an opera. So I love all sorts of music.
You can cheat. You can come up with 3 titles if you want, or 2.
Okay, so again, I'm not going to come up with a title, but favorite musicians, Habib Kwate, who is a Malian singer. My husband is from Mali. I lived in Mali for 14 years. Malian music is just the best music on earth. It is just amazing. Ali Farka Touré, Oumou Sangaré. Just please, everyone, go out and listen to it if you haven't ever listened to it before. Again, kind of American roots music. So Rhiannon Giddens, Bonnie Raitt, James Taylor, Pete Seeger, just music, and then rhythm and blues, John Lee Hooker, Howlin' Wolf. That music all really relates to me. Stevie Ray, the Black Keys. And then the Bach cello sonatas played by Yo-Yo Ma.
Okay, great.
And that there are no words to that, but there don't need to be words. It's just
And if I understand you, this relates to the places where you've lived, where you because of people you love, those type of things. That's kind of my conclusion when I listen to you. And is that correct? Yeah,
it is correct, and it's music that is very, kind of deep inside of you, in your soul.
Okay. Just to remind the listeners, we made a playlist on Spotify, and I almost, not to all the guests that I've had, but many of the guests I asked this question. So, the list becomes longer and longer. I really listen to it myself often because it reminds me of, my guests, but it's also, it's a wide range from hard rock to classical music. And so I enjoyed it. So I would encourage people to check that out. Christine, these conversations always go fast. Maybe my last question that I have for you is any message, invitation, or question for the listeners?
So I think that where I've ended up in the last couple of years is really about being thoughtful and deliberate. And that goes along with the idea that you can make mistakes. But when you make mistakes, recognize them, apologize, but then really think about okay, what was my mistake? What can I do differently? Let me ask someone for their input. Let me make a commitment to reset my behavior or to try and do things differently in the future. And I think that something that's been very hard for a lot of people, and frankly is the cause of a lot of our current conflict, is the idea that we're now speaking openly about hurt and harm that has been caused over hundreds of years by the way that society has been structured and has acted, and people tend to come at it as oppositional forces about blame and finger pointing, or even if it's not being delivered, that the message isn't delivered that way, people take it very personally. And what I just encourage everyone to do is think about it more from the perspective of a conversation. Think of it more from the perspective of, again, okay, harm was done. What can I do differently? How can we work differently in the future? And so it doesn't have to perpetuate the harm or compound the harm, but it can be the opportunity for new discussion, for healing, for empathy. And so, but you have to be deliberate in that. And that you shouldn't, oh, I feel so bad that I did this thing that I can't possibly ever talk about it again. For me, that's the wrong reaction. It's, oh, look at this thing. Now let's open and look forward and think, how can I engage around this and come up with ways to do things differently?
I really appreciate this comment from you. I really believe in, the conversation. And one of the reasons that I have this podcast is also to show people that, we have more in common often than there are differences. And it's based, as I said, always in the beginning of the podcast, based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial, and nobody can be wrong 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So, I would like to thank you for today, for sharing your incredible insights. I think it's a must listen to from my perspective for every CEO out there. Is looking at the future of his or her organization. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much. I would like to tell the listeners that they should check out your website. I will mention that in the podcast notes, but also check out your articles that you often write in DevX. Mm-hmm. Really insightful, important, crucial. So thank you so much, and thanks for everything you do, Christine.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you today. And thanks to your listeners for paying attention and being interested.
Great, thanks.
All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.